that was allotted for it. So thank you, everyone. Can everyone see my screen? I think so. Thumbs up. Yeses. Excellent. Great. Thank you for joining us today. Today I'm going to discuss implementing an Unessay in my courses. I've done this in 2 different courses. I'm going to focus a little more on implementing the Unessay in my senior seminar course, but I also did it most recently in my death penalty class, which was also very exciting and successful in many different ways. And so I'll, share, any of the differences and things that came up in that class as well. So, good. Okay, I just saw the chat that everyone affirmed that you could see my slide. So thank you. All right. Actually, on this slide here, you can see this was a Monopoly game that one of my students created as part of her Unessay. And actually, this student is now my babysitter. She's a wonderful, wonderful student. Created this to showcase the differences in criminal justice related outcomes when you have different socioeconomic circumstances. So I'll go into more detail about how this game worked in a few minutes. All right, so first, an Unessay is exactly how it sounds. It is a departure from a traditional written assignment in criminal justice. In capstone courses, it's very common to assign a very lengthy research paper, as a capstone to a undergraduate curriculum. But with an essay, students get to select a topic that's of interest to them, related to the course content. It communicates the synthesis of their research, but they can do this in any way they choose. So, the goal here was to really get students to think creatively and to give them a lot of autonomy and flexibility in the way that they presented their research. And because of this, students tended to pick modes of expressing their research that was different than just writing a research paper. So it was a really exciting experience for everyone. But I wanted to talk a little bit about why I decided to do an Unessay, and I'm curious, for those of you who are attending, why this might be interesting to you. But the first time I really got excited about an Unessay in my course is when one of our former Plattsburgh colleagues, Jessamyn Neuhaus, had presented her work on an Unessay for our spring breakout workshops. I've linked the recording. I can send that to anyone who needs it. You can also find it on the CELT YouTube site as well. But she started talking about this Unessay, and I had been long dreading teaching a capstone course because of these 30-page research paper assignments that the students typically hated doing. And I remember listening to faculty members who were teaching these courses. They hated assessing those papers, and I was kind of filled with a lot of dread thinking about doing teaching a capstone course when there was a whole lot of negative feelings around like big capstone projects. And so when Jessamyn presented her work and using Unessays, I was very excited to try something new and to give my students more options than just writing a traditional research paper. And as Jessamyn was talking about these Unessays, I was immediately taken back to an experience I had in graduate school. I was taking a course on race and racism in the criminal justice system, and one of my classmates had written her paper at the end of the semester, had written her paper on the use of food as punishment in prisons and policies surrounding a controversial practice of punishing prisoners with by limiting the types of food that they can eat. And so if you ever look up Nutriloaf, it is a loaf of all kinds of ingredients that meet the nutritional needs of any person that's, I guess, is eating that meal. But it's a very bland, very tasteless. It often includes a lot of foods that we wouldn't typically put together in a meal. In some cases, it might be like a meat loaf with spaghetti blended into it, with chickpeas blended into it. It's not a very appetizing meal, and it's been used as punishment for infractions that occur in prisons. And so this paper, she talked about the research that she had conducted, but then she also baked a common Nutriloaf recipe and brought it into the class for everyone to try and sample. And that always stuck with me in a way that, I mean, to this day, this was over 10 years ago, I still remember the taste of that Nutriloaf in my mouth, and thinking how cruel it was to punish people in this particular way. And it's definitely something that has kind of fueled my passions on abolition and thinking about the inhumane practices that exist in prisons. So that these kind of experiences made me realize that we could provide some unique, exciting opportunities for students to achieve the same learning outcomes that we might assign in a research paper, without forcing them to write a 30-page paper that they may not enjoy, or that they do just to get a grade and to forget about it the next semester. I wanted something that was going to stick with them the way that the Nutriloaf had stuck with me for over a decade. And so this also aligned very much with my goals of inclusive teaching and learning, and allowing students to express their learning in different ways. And again, to bring that sort of autonomy and that intrinsic, and build that intrinsic motivation for students to engage in research in some flexible, unique, and fun ways. And so to those who are joining me today, if you want to, do you want to share a little bit why an Unessay is interesting to you, or if it is something that you're thinking about considering in your courses?
Sure, I'll share. I was really, I guess I'm interested to see how many students choose this route when given the option between essay and some other, unessay assignment. And
Mhm.
then two, just to gather some ideas on some different types of assessment and engagement for students.
Excellent, thank you. And I'll definitely get into all of those details. Mamta?
I actually am thinking of not doing it in my capstone, because capstone projects are supposed to be writing intensive. So maybe not all assignment, maybe one of the writing assignments it can actually replace with an essay kind of things, or gamification. But what I'm thinking is thinking diversity course next semester. And
Mhm.
within that, I'm always looking for some kind of activity based stuff. And probably, and this is something came to my mind, the Monopoly game that you just presented actually may be helpful in understanding intersectionality with all the isms that we talk about in that course. Of course, I do lots of video games, lots of video simulations in that for each one of the isms that we talk about,
Mhm.
and other things as well, like implicit bias inventory and all those things. But I think one of them can be, or the end, it can be Monopoly or something else that you would present. I would love to hear more from you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say that this course, the senior capstone course, is a writing intensive course, and we still very much met the goals of our writing plan within this course, despite doing a traditional, or despite doing an untraditional project like an Unessay. And so I'll just share a little bit about what that looked like in the class. So we had specific learning objectives for this course that were developed by the department. And I was able to link each of these objectives to our particular, to the Unessay assignment. So, to critically analyze empirical research as it relates to criminal justice policies and practices, conduct independent research in criminal justice, develop written communication skills and oral communication skills. So this assignment did include some writing. It just didn't culminate in a long traditional research paper, right? So students did create a proposal, and this is very similar to the way Jessamyn had, and I'll share a link to the work that she's posted on her website as well. So you can see how she's formatted her assignments as well. But it started with a proposal. Students would engage in research, write a summary of that research to argue the importance of that topic. And in that proposal, they would also identify the ways they were going to achieve the learning objectives through this untraditional Unessay. And following the proposal, we have revisions, of all of their written work, which helped us meet those requirements of our writing plan. So in our department, we've identified that for a course to meet a writing plan designation, they were required to have a draft submission and the opportunity to revise based on feedback, a subsequent submission. And so I incorporated that practice, and I do this in all of my writing assessments, but I incorporated that into every scaffolded part of this assignment. So the proposal, they would get feedback from me and their peers, and would then incorporate that feedback into a subsequent submission, and I'll share a little bit about that in a little while. Following the proposal, we had a midterm meeting, and this was often to kind of talk over some of the comments and feedbacks on that proposal, to help identify any areas that needed addressing, and to think about what their presentations might look like. So some students proposed to write a play, and that required a lot more class time to have a presentation, whereas some students wrote a short story, and so that required them to send out their short story to be read ahead of time in advance of class. And so there were some technical things that were also addressed at this midterm meeting, but ultimately the goal of our midterm meeting was to talk about each assignment, ensure that they were set up for meeting the learning objectives that were required for this project, and to make any changes to the proposal to ensure that they would receive full marks, full credit on that work. Following that, students were tasked with creating an annotated bibliography, and so this is where the research part really became salient in the project. That their goal in this project was to communicate empirical research as it related to their topics. So even students who had more creative projects, like writing a short story or creating a play for their classmates to act in, they still had to have all of those scripts and all of these projects informed by the literature. And so the annotated bibliography really helped them figure out where that research was and how it would how it would inform their projects. Following that assignment, the students would then present their project. And again, we sort of determined the logistics of that at the midterm meeting so that we made sure there was enough time at the end of the semester for everyone to thoroughly present their work to the class. Following their project presentation, they engaged in a project statement, which was a bit more of an elaboration on their proposal, but also included a self-assessment and a reflection on how they met each of those learning objectives. It allowed them to identify the strengths and weaknesses of their project, and ultimately it helped them collate and gather all of the evidence that they would need for our final meeting, which helped us determine the grade for each of these projects. Some of the things I did on the back end for students, especially because this was the first time any of these students had engaged in an Unessay. It was the first time, at least in my recollection, that any of our capstone sections in our department had ever done something other than a traditional research paper. And so I wanted to make sure that the students had enough examples of each assignment so that they were, best prepared for, knowing what the expectations were and having the structure they needed to be successful in the class. So I'm gonna just share this assignment sheet that I created. It's an infographic of, and it's a sort of poster that I created for the students that I included with their syllabi. And I linked to it in our LMS. But essentially it identifies the purpose of the Unessay, the goal of an Unessay. I gave them important dates to think about. I gave them some ideas. So it could be a performance, video, art. They could reinvent board games. They could do a cooking or baking project. They could create a lesson plan. I had a lot of students create lesson plans because they were interested in going into education later in their careers. And so this actually, I'll share a little bit about one of them in a few. They could create a D&D style campaign where they had character arcs and allowed students to create their characters as they engaged in a world building game. I didn't actually have anyone do that, but I always thought that would be a pretty fun class period if a student was so interested in doing something like that. I gave them ideas of holding an event on campus or doing something beyond the classroom that would reach more than just the group of us in the course. I included again here a little bit why I thought an Unessay was appropriate for this particular class. To meet the learning objectives, but also to reflect the inclusive pedagogy that I had hoped to center in our classroom. I gave them a little bit of an overview of each type of assignment that would go into their Unessay. And I can send this to all of you if you'd like as well. I'm kind of moving past it here. But I did want to mention briefly that because we were doing this untraditional assignment, I thought it was appropriate to also try an untraditional grading technique. And so I used ungrading for this particular assessment, which in some ways it was challenging, but I thought it ended up being a really rewarding experience for me. I think my students, in some ways, it was harder for me to accept in a new alternative grading system than I think it was for them to accept. For them, it just made sense that in a course where I wasn't going to provide grades on the specific scaffolded assignments, that I would simply give them feedback and expect that they were going to incorporate that feedback until there was no more feedback to provide. And they really took, they seem to be more, and maybe it was the culture of this particular class and the relationships they had with me and with their classmates, but they did exceptional with this move to a alternative grading system. So I was really pleased with how it worked out, and I'll share a little bit more about how that worked in a little bit. But I gave them some examples, some more in-depth examples of something they might want to consider. So if you have ever played the game of life, it's a board game where you move through each space, and as you land on different spaces, different life events like getting a job or buying a house or building a family or falling into hardships will set you back or put you forward towards the end goal of retiring in a particular retirement community. Okay, so this is kind of the concept of the game of life. And so to reimagine that particular board game that also identified the collateral consequences of being incarcerated was interesting, kind of unique and almost fun way to show people just how difficult it can be to re-enter society following incarceration, given a lot of the restrictions and consequences of having a conviction can have on the way people engage in social life post incarceration. And so I tried to give them some more examples on how they might do this. We spent a lot of time talking about different ideas in class before they created their proposals so that they got comfortable with being creative and kind of thinking outside of the box. Okay, so more examples. As I mentioned, the Monopoly game, it featured these criminal justice process outcomes for people of varying socioeconomic status. So the community chest cards and, the different squares on each of the playing board would relate to issues that we talk about in criminal justice as it relates to bail or plea bargaining, the burden of indigent defense and the kind of funding that goes into that versus a prosecutor's office, the different punishment outcomes, the way that fees and fines are used in the criminal justice system as punishments or ways to fund different parts of the criminal justice system and how that might impact a person's experience in the criminal justice system when they don't have money to rely on. So that was an interesting game. The students then split up into teams and they would play a few rounds, each of them. And they had a lot of fun. It was a good class for sure. I had a couple of students do podcasts that highlighted issues around campus sexual assault. Some were interviews of students across the country. It was one of my students had friends at different universities. They talked about some of the different resources and policies that they had at their universities and how it made them feel. And in turn, she compared that to what we know in the literature about people's feelings of safety on campus and how that and how different policies might impact those feelings of safety. So it was a long podcast, but it was very engaging. And it was kind of like a video podcast, I suppose. She uploaded it onto YouTube, and you could have it download as a audio as well. So it was that was kind of unique project in that. We had some students create a series of TikTok videos where they examined student perceptions on various criminal justice topics. They also compared that to what research exists on public opinion as it relates to those topics. So in that way, they're demonstrating the synthesis of the research on public opinion in criminal justice by comparing it to, the types of beliefs and views that people around our campus held. So it was, that was also a lot of fun to watch the students do that. Again, I mentioned a play was created, a play script was written to talk about, or it described political candidates and their views on criminality and subsequent policies. So this really brought a lot of criminological theory into the project and how our policies are connected to those theories and informed by those theories. I had a student do a choose your own adventure that was kind of like a Goosebumps novel where, you flip to one page if you want your character to have a particular outcome, and they would flip to the, 30 pages ahead and follow the story as certain decisions were made. So this student had a decision-making tree and had various outcomes based on their understanding and research on the barriers that exist when re-entering society following being incarcerated. We also had some short stories on criminalization of abortion. We had a student who was formally involved with a gang, and so talked about some of the subcultural aspects of gangs and some of the outcomes for people who are associated with gangs, and created a short story that brought in some of his own personal experiences, but also connected it to what is known in the research about gang involvement. So I did this again most recently with my death penalty course. We had some video interviews about public opinion research, so kind of like the TikTok video series that I mentioned in the capstone class. I had some students examining last meal policies and how they've shifted and changed over time, and kind of debating some of the ethical ethics around a last meal policy, and whether it was humane or whether it was providing some kind of false sense of control in those last moments. And it was a very interesting project. But I had some students do a podcast around that topic. I also had some students bake and recreate some of those last meals or items from those last meals. And they created kind of menus, and they created this, whole narrative about these last meals. And it was a very moving project. I also had a student write poetry as it relates to the death penalty. So they sent their poem out to the class ahead of their presentation, and then they spent most of their presentation kind of talking through the poem line by line and explaining what they were hoping to communicate in this, and also facilitating a discussion among the class on how the poem made them feel and how it connected to things that they had learned in the class and so forth. All right, and I promised I'd get back to this, but for this non-traditional assignment, I thought it was appropriate and interesting and exciting for me to also incorporate a non-traditional assessment practice. So as I mentioned, I did an ungrading practice for this particular assessment. In this, I incorporated this sort of mantra of all feedback and no grades. I expected to have, again, more challenge with student buy-in for this, but the students really went with the flow with this project. They were, I think, kind of relieved to not have grades at every step of this project, and they were able to focus on actually incorporating the feedback and not what that translated to in terms of a letter grade that I, somewhat arbitrarily assigned. Again, the challenges I actually had with that was my own buy-in and my own comfort in trying this new technique. And I will say that after doing it in one semester, it became much easier to continue a system of ungrading in this type of assessment. Now, of course, you don't have to use an alternative grading system for an Unessay, but I did find that it naturally worked really well, at least for my class and for my needs, and for my students' needs in the class as well. The self-assessment in the final meeting, so as part of ungrading, students then propose with evidence what their grade should be. And so we did this through a self-assessment tool that they completed on paper prior to our final meeting. And I had each student sign up for a meeting with me during our exam week. And I, simply proposed to them, given all of their given our discussion about their projects, their determination of whether they've met the learning objectives and the evidence that they were providing to show that they did indeed achieve those learning objectives, I would ask them to propose a grade. I had a lot of fears around this. I thought there was going to be a lot of disagreement, a lot of very messy decisions. But the reality was that we were all mostly in agreement. There were only 2 students out of the 31 students that I assessed in this across 2 sections of this course. There were only 2 that were slightly off. One was more off than another, but upon revisiting the evidence and it all worked out really well. Some challenges that I did have, I think this goes with any sort of hybrid grading practice, is that I was using an untraditional grading practice alongside a traditional grading practice for other assessments in the course. And so there was a little bit of, okay, in order for me to, have a grade for the entire course, I had to now reconcile an ungrading practice with these other graded assessments. And so I had to ultimately come up with a grade for the ungrading practice, but it was one that I collaborated with my students on. And so it felt, it was challenging to kind of then decide, so, are we going to decide together that you get a 91 versus a 92? But with this, and with, the discussions I had with my students, it really wasn't hard to find a common ground and agreement on the grade. And again, it might have been because my students were in their senior capstone. They were a little bit they were more mature in a lot of different ways. And, they also have had a little bit of practice up until this point to advocate for themselves. And this also kind of provided a chance for them to exercise those skills in the classroom. So it worked out. I had a lot of fears around this sort of conflict that seemed to be inevitable in this final meeting, but it actually, in reality, was much easier to determine than I had expected. Things that went better than expected. The Brightspace platform does a really good job for providing feedback and then allowing students to continually resubmit under the same submission link. So then I could toggle very easily between their previous submissions, the comments that I had given them, and their next submission. And so some students would submit, their proposals 3 or 4 times Most of them submitted at least twice. Or I should say resubmitted twice. So they had 3 versions ultimately of their work. But some had, 4 or 5 versions of their work. And by having it all in the same Brightspace link, assignment submission link, I could then just toggle between each stage and see how they progressed from one version to another, and so on. So you can adjust the settings on Brightspace to allow for unlimited submissions, to ensure that the files they submit are annotatable within the Brightspace platform. So I can make comments directly into their documents, and it became very easy for them to see that feedback and then resubmit upon incorporating that feedback. Things I wish I did a little bit better, and I did this a little bit more in the death penalty class, was to incorporate more peer feedback in the early stages. I had them do some peer feedback in the seminar course, kind of in the later stages of their project. And I think having them engage in conversations with each other earlier and more often would have given them each a bit more confidence in engaging in these projects, because it's a lot to kind of put your more creative selves out there. It's a little more vulnerable than just writing a 30-page paper. And so I think, having that connection early on in the class would have been helpful. I should have also had students submit their project deliverable well before their presentation, because as students do, they tend to wait till the last minute to get things totally polished before they have to submit something. And one of the goals of this project was for them to work on their oral communication. And I think I would have liked for them to have more practice with that. And that would have meant having some of those outcomes, those written outcomes as it related to their presentation, completed a little earlier so that they could focus on that particular skill at the presentation. But I also think, having more self-assessments at each of the scaffolded stages, as opposed to overall, would have been helpful in reminding students a bit more about the work they completed in those earlier stages of the project, because they would have reflected on it more. We would have gone into our final meetings with multiple self-assessments in tow for their grade discussion. And then things I shouldn't have done. I see your hand raised, Mamta. I'll get to you in a second. I shouldn't have made the project statement due so late in the semester, because that itself would have also benefited from some revisions. I had to do like at the very last day of class, and so we didn't have time to do unlimited revisions on that particular part of the project. So, in hindsight, having those things having everything due a little bit earlier to get some of those other skills time to develop would have been helpful. Mamta, go for it.
Actually, there is a question in the chat. I just wanted her to be answered first, and then I can ask my questions.
Oh, okay, sure. Yes, these were semester-long projects. Yep. And I kind of shared a little bit in the, let me see if I can bring that up here. Oops. Shared it a little bit here. I should have mentioned that like more explicitly, but I had like important dates here. So, end of September, their project proposals were due. They had an annotated bibliography a couple of weeks later. They had midterm meetings, a proposal revision.
Which one would you have done sooner then? Which one of those pieces you said you should have had something submitted a little sooner? The proposal? Because that seems pretty.
Yeah, I would have had, so I had given them feedback on their proposals like at the beginning of October. I didn't have them actually, so I required at least one revision of the proposal. Most of them did multiple revisions of the proposal. But I didn't have that required until the very end of October, and presentations started that very next week. And so they needed, I should have had this revision much earlier in the month so that I knew that we were all on the same page going into the presentations. Because the presentations, it took a few weeks to get through every person's presentation because some of them required an hour of class time. Some of them required a half an hour. Some of them required 10 minutes. I did have kind of a minimum of time that I wanted them to present in front of the class so I could assess their oral communication. But depending on their projects, they, some had more, some had, shorter times. And I think, having the revision of this proposal required earlier would have ensured that when they came to their presentations, they weren't working on incorporating that revision like just a few days before they would present. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's perfect. I was just curious because I thought it was closer to, November or so on, but yeah, I guess that's still, they could definitely use some more time, especially because it's such a big project.
Yeah. And, I allocated all of November for presentations for a class of 15. That was the right amount of time. Some students did their essays in groups, which I allowed them to do. They did have to submit each of these individually. They had to submit a proposal, an annotated bibliography, and a project statement. They had to do all of that individually, but they could do their presentations together. And so I did allow them to work together on different pieces, but they had to complete their own writing for those particular assessments. Of course, you don't have to do as, I do recommend scaffolding, your essays as much as you can, just to keep things reasonable for students and to, give them that kind of structure throughout the semester. But if you do an essay just as like, this was a big project, right? So I wanted it to incorporate a lot of the learning objectives that we had for the course. If this were, an essay was just, a smaller project, then, I wouldn't have, probably had as many scaffolded pieces to it. I might have just had them, had it be a smaller part of the course. But in each time I've done an essay, it's taken place of typically a semester long paper. And so it's kind of followed that same trajectory. But it doesn't have to. It can be as small as possible, right? It can be, it could be a weekly thing if you wanted. You could have them do all kinds of, you could, create opportunities to do alternatives to writing, a response, in any kind of way.
Mm-hmm. So Maggie, how good were students, since you were not giving them any grades other than the feedback, right?
Yeah.
And therefore that external motivation is not there. How good were students about retaining the feedback that you've given them and including it in their own projects?
Yeah, so it was a lot of reminders in class. It was, every time a student resubmitted a revision, I had set a setting in I had turned on a setting in Brightspace that it would email me to tell me, that, oh, the student had submitted this assignment. So I was able to go right back into it, very quickly. It was challenging, right, to provide this kind of unlimited feedback for students. It was challenging. I had to, set aside time every week. I tried to do it, every Monday, allocate a couple of hours that day to, go through to see if there were any revisions. Sometimes it would take me multiple days that week. Some days it would, take me just, 30 minutes to review one of their assignments. But they, I essentially would, and I did a couple of things. I made a lot of written revisions on like annotations in Brightspace, but I also did some voice recordings over their assignments as well. Brightspace gives you the option to record like audio as you're giving feedback to them. So I did that as well. And essentially every time they would make a revision, they would, or every time, they would, I would give them feedback. I'd look back to see what I had commented on. Did they do all of the revisions? And I told them that ultimately, if they wanted to show that they were producing work that was acceptable for an A grade, they would exhaust all of the feedback that I had given them. And so in some ways there was, right, a motivation because we had to determine a grade at the end of this. We had to create a letter grade because that is required of the course, right? So even though it followed this kind of non-traditional grading style, it still resulted, right, in an external grade. And I did give them an expectation of, if you do this, you can ensure that you're going to get an A on this portion if you incorporate all the feedback. And so they were motivated in that. And I also, in the self-assessment, had it very clearly on there, did you incorporate the feedback upon every revision you submitted? And they had to say yes or no. And if, they said yes, and I looked back and said no, I would bring it up and say, well, you said you did all of this, but here's where you didn't. And they'd be like, oh yeah, okay, and it would just, it would kind of, it would be a conversation that we would have. I was afraid they would, might try to, say they did more than they did. But in the end, like, it was their responsibility to bring in the evidence that says, I did all of these things. I did it to the point of, where I'm not only am I proud of my work and feel like I've achieved these learning objectives, but in conversation with your feedback, I've engaged in it and incorporated it to such a level that I propose I get an A in this project. Most students actually didn't propose A's for themselves. I'd have to go back and see the actual breakdown because I can't remember at the top of my head, but most students were a little hesitant to go for a full A. So they would, propose maybe a B plus, an A minus. And again, we would talk through all of those. We would talk through the justifications and ensure that we were agreeing on each of those points.
Yeah. Do you think, actually, I have two questions.
Yes.
Do you think if they would have written to you with every assignment and after every feedback, how they have incorporated your feedback? That kind of a letter or a memo would help?
Yeah, I think that would be wonderful. And that was part of their self-assessment. So their self-assessment had, it wasn't created in a memo, but I think a memo would be a really good idea for that. But their self-assessment, would go into, each assignment that we had as part of this project. And it would ask, did you incorporate all this feedback, and, provide an example of how you improved this, submission from its original submission. And so they did have kind of an opportunity to do that on a separate assessment. It was survey. It was also open-ended questions. But I think a memo would be a really good example of that.
Yeah. And the second question that I have is, since each student has a different kind of assignment or potentially can choose a different kind of an assignment.
Yeah.
And in that sense, how are we grading them? Meaning somebody can choose a board game, somebody can choose a TikTok, somebody can choose a story. What are the common elements yet on which you are grading?
Yeah. So, so every student still did a proposal. Everyone did an annotated bibliography. Everyone did some type of a presentation, and everyone did some type of a project statement. So in all of the, despite the varying ways of presenting their learning in their research in this. They still had the same expectations of meeting each learning objective and identifying, like, here's the learning objectives and this is how I met them. So they all had the same common goals. It just varied in the way they decided to present that information. Does that follow?
Yeah, yeah. No, I definitely, I'm just imagining for myself how I can
Yeah.
actually do it if I have to do it in my capstone project too.
Yeah.
And like, as I said, because one of our objectives is APA writing and scholarly writing.
Yeah.
And that's why I mentioned earlier that I can replace one or two,
Mhm.
like I also scaffold a lot, and they create a portfolio with almost like 10
Yeah.
or 12 assignments, and each assignment is peer reviewed and then given feedback by me after the peer review.
Right.
So, and then they have to submit everything together at the end. So it's a long drawn process, but
Yeah.
it really helps. But I also grade them on everything. And so I'm thinking in my
Yeah.
head, like, how can I do this?
Yeah,
So just
totally.
figuring out,
Now,
yeah.
Unessay won't work if for that component of the grade or the learning objective that's tied to writing essays.
Yeah, right.
Correct.
And I should say that, like, in their proposal, they did have to write a little summary of the research to justify, like, the importance of that topic. So they did write some. It just wasn't, a massive
An essay.
it was a brief summary. And they did use APA in that. They used citations. They did have an annotated bibliography that all required APA format to it. So they still met all of those objectives. It just wasn't in a 30-page extended research paper that they all, most of the time, were so dreading that it became such a source of anxiety for them. In this way, it still had, like, I think a lot of that academic writing in it, but it was so much more than that, right? It wasn't the only thing that they were producing. It was just a piece of what they were producing in this project. But I do want to say that we are at our time. But if you have any more questions, always feel free to send me an email. I can absolutely send you out this. I should have a QR code to, like, copy the slides, but I did not remember to do that this time around. So let me know if you have any more questions. I love talking about this, and I'm happy to continue talking about it. But thank you both so much.
And we also have a podcast.
Oh, yes. Okay. That's what I should tell you. Oh, yeah. Here's some more helpful Unessay resources. There's a lot out there. But John had mentioned this is the Tea for Teaching podcast that Jessamyn and I both were guests on, talking about Unessays, and I have the self-assessment here and such. I can send this out to anyone who would like it. And if anyone is watching this at a later time, always send me an email and I'm happy to pass this along. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.